Hello, my name is Johanna, and I would like to provide an outline of our paper, Buyer Participation in Outsourced New Product Development, the Role of Relationship Multiplexity. This is joint work with Stefan Wuyts and Inge Geyskens. So this research focuses on the situation of outsourced new product development. For example, when Airbus outsourced the development of the A350 plane's engines to Rolls-Royce. Now, in that situation, Airbus did not just sit back and relax and wait until the engine was done, though. Instead, it actively participated in the fundamental research program to develop new materials for the engine. Now, this practice of buyer participation in outsourced new product development becomes more complicated when buyers take on more than one role in the relationship. This concept is called relationship multiplexity. For example, in the Airbus and Rolls-Royce situation, they are also partners in space research consortia, constituting another tie in the relationship between these two parties. Or take Apple, which as a buyer also has a competitive tie in its relationship with its supplier Samsung. Role reversal situations also happen when the buyer and supplier switch roles in other ties of the same relationship. So this leads us to our main research question, which is how does relationship multiplexity change the effectiveness of buyer participation in outsourced new product development? To illustrate the knowledge gap that we are addressing in this research, I'd like to quote a manager we interviewed in our pilot study. He said the following: "I am not sure whether we should allow buyer X to participate in the MPD process, as we also compete against each other. Or should we let buyer Y participate in the development process, as it's also our partner in a consortium, right? I don't know. I believe the other roles played by our buyers in relation to our firms may matter and should be taken into account when we decide on buyer participation." In our study, we look at several types of relationship multiplexity: buyer as competitor multiplexity, buyer as supplier multiplexity, and buyer as partner multiplexity. We split up the latter based on the formation of the partnership: engineered partnerships orchestrated by a third party, and emergent partnership in which the partners find each other organically. Now, our paper has a couple of academic contributions, of which I want to discuss three. Now, existing research on buyer participation thus far focused on one tie between the supplier and the buyer. Instead, we take into account this multiplex nature of the relationship, addressing calls for research. Now, furthermore, most existing research assumes asymmetry across the dyad. Now, we recognize asymmetries in perceptions which may exist and test our hypothesis at both sides of the dyad. Third, we focus on role theory, which is our theoretical lens for the study. Now, that thus far has focused on one actor's roles in relation to different parties. Now, we extend role theory by studying roles across different ties in a single relationship between two parties. To test our hypothesis, we used a sample of 140 new product development projects executed by a contract R&D organization in the aerospace industry. We used a wide variety of data. For secondary data, we used first of all, project evaluations that were given by both buyers and suppliers that were administered at the project closure by quality assurance officers of the contract R&D firm. Furthermore, we also analyzed strategic cooperation plans to get an idea of buyer as partner multiplexity and procurement records to identify buyer as supplier multiplexity. For primary data, we used competitor identification information from the focal firm, and we were also able to send a small survey to project managers to collect more details on buyer participation. Next, I would like to give some highlights from the study's results. First, we look at the buyer perception side. So here we see graphs lifted from our paper showing the moderating impact of no versus high levels of relationship multiplexity on the effectiveness of buyer participation. On the left, we see that buyer participation in a competitive relationship is a bad idea as it hurts project success. We argue that this is due to role conflict. One of the mechanisms is that buyers may fear that their shared knowledge in the cooperative tie will be opportunistically used in the competitive tie. Perceived project success is also hurt in multiplex relationships in which the buyer takes on the reverse role as supplier. We argue that this is due to role ambiguity. We argue that this role ambiguity arises due to a lack of clarity regarding role expectations. This leads to uncertainty. Should the participating buyer exert its bargaining power or should it not, given the risk of reciprocal actions from the developing supplier? Ambiguity makes it hard to define role expectations, requiring the sorting out of these role expectations, which makes buyer participation less effective. Now, on the right, we see buyer as emergent partners, where we find that buyer participation actually benefits project success. And we argue that this is due to role synergy. We think that the development of knowledge sharing routines in the collaborative tie will facilitate buyer participation in the focal tie, where knowledge exchange is important as well. Now, interestingly, when a buyer and a supplier have a partnership that is engineered by a third party, the synergy does not seem to materialize. We argue that that is due to being put together by a third party, which means that the benefits of a partnership develop more slowly, which does not benefit buyer participation in the focal buyer-supplier tie. Next, I would like to look at the supplier perception as we took a pluralistic view of the effects of buyer participation on project success. What we see here is that the patterns differ, which suggests that there is an added value to look at both sides. Importantly, the negative moderating effect of buyer as competitor multiplexity disappears, which we think is due to asymmetric role expectations for shirking. A buyer may fear shirking as it shares knowledge with the supplier, but the supplier contracts out its knowledge to the buyer already, removing fear from opportunistic appropriation. These were some highlights of our paper. To get a full picture of our work, I would like to invite you to read our article in the Journal of Operations Management. For now, thank you for your attention.